We just want to extend a welcome from Classical Academic Press to students, parents, teachers, community, and school leaders. Welcome to this live discussion, this live webinar, as well as anyone who is listening via the recording later. I am Ash White, and along with Mr. Jimmy Shambach, we are teachers through CAP's Skole Academy, teachers of our logic courses. And we are also joined by Joelle Hodge, who is our illustrious author and teacher emeritus of all of our logic courses. And we'll be introducing her a little further, a little bit later today. And before we get into that, though, Jimmy is going to share with you some other resources that are available to you.
Yeah, excited to have you all here. The task is for me to talk a little bit about some of the partnerships we have here with, as well with Skole Academy. Skole Academy, this place, as Ash said, she and I teach. We support homeschool families by offering live and online classical Christian courses K through 12. And all of the classes can be kind of purchased a la carte, so you can personalize it to your family needs. We do have open enrollments now for the 25-26 school year. And we have nearly 500 online live course selections K through 12, and you'll probably, I think, be able to find something that you'll need for your family. And we also have a year-round tutoring center for families that are needing that kind of support, and that's for all ages. And so it's a really cool thing. We've been enjoying this, and I enjoy teaching as part of it. We also have
So
classical
Jamie, can I jump in really quickly? Because something I
Sure.
forgot to mention is if those of you who are with us on the webinar would, if in the chat box you will introduce yourselves and just tell us where you're from, so we can see just where everyone is zooming in from today. Sorry, Jimmy, go ahead.
Oh yeah, that's a good reminder. So in addition to Skole Academy, we also have Classical U, and this is not only we offer the K through 12 stuff, but for adults and parents and other educators, we also offer Classical U. These are courses that are recorded that you can take at your own pace, that offer training and overviews of various subjects that we offer and teach. And so you can do a consult there on Classical U. I think it's classicalu.com, correct, Jolie?
It is.
And you can find extra information about that as well as consultations, and you can book a training on there as well as see lots of other courses that we offer. One of which is Logic, which we're going to talk about, and Jolie's going to share a lot about today. And then the last part is that Classical Academic Press offers 3 different textbooks on logic for us: The Art of Argument, Discovery of Deduction, and The Argument Builder. So yeah, that's it.
Awesome. So, but let me tell you a little bit about our presenter today. Joelle Hodge holds a BA in History and Political Science from Messiah University in Grantham, Pennsylvania, and a Master of Arts in Teaching from Eastern University's Templeton Honors College. She began her career as a staffer to United States Senator Arlen Specter before finding her professional home in the world of classical education in 1999. She has more than 25 years of classical education experience and has co-authored 2 of our logic books, The Art of Argument and Introduction to the Informal Fallacies, and The Discovery of Deduction and Introduction to Formal Logic, both published by Classical Academic Press. And she continues to support various projects at CAP, and she's currently got her primary focus on supporting the growth and development of Classical Academic Press in her role as president. So let me turn things over to Joelle.
Thank you both. Ash and Jimmy, could you just remind me how long you've been teaching at Skole Academy? I know I hired both of you, but I cannot remember. It's been a while.
Yeah, I've been for 6 years, right before COVID hit. And I thought, ooh, I'm going to stick with this gig.
Same, yeah. I've done it 7 years now, and I guess if you have a student who takes class with me, Jolie trained me, so if you enjoy the class, that speaks well of Jolie, and if it's bad, I guess also the same thing.
Nice.
No,
Perhaps. Yeah,
I'm
that
just
would logically follow. That would
logically it
logically.
would follow that way, but
It would.
I'll own my own failings. All of the good things can come from your side. So
Oh, no, that's not true. No, Jimmy and Ash's class are two of the their classes that they teach. They're some of the most popular classes at Scolay Academy and have been for a very, very long time. And it's not just because they understand the content knowledge, but that, obviously they care for their students and everything, but they have a way of even sort of breaking through that Zoom window and really connecting with the kids. And they just really love working with both of you. I've heard and I continue to hear all about how you're doing at Scolay Academy, and it's just wonderful. In fact, the director of Scolay Academy is among our attendees today. Dr. Joellen Blake is sitting in there as well. So she's watching both of you, I'm sure, right now. But I won't belabor things anymore. But these are two friends and longtime colleagues of mine, and I'm really glad that we can be together this way. Let's see here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Move things around just a little bit so I can still see people I need to see. There we go. All right, so I'm going to be talking today about logic for the real world, how to apply logic in today's, kind of chaotic, irrational world that we live in. I'm really grateful to be here with you and host this conversation. I think it's about something foundational and essential, not only to the life of the mind, but also to the shaping of the soul. And that's a pretty big claim. So let's see if I can convince you of it with my astounding logical and rhetorical skills here. So I want to begin today with a quote from Hugh of St. Victor. He was a 12th century thinker and educator. He wrote a book called The Didascalicon. And this quote from that text, it really resonates with me. It's this, he talks about always learning, but never reaching knowledge. And that quote feels a little bit haunting in a way. In his world, as in ours, there are plenty of students who gather information, but they never really arrive at understanding, and plenty of scholars who accumulate knowledge, but they lack wisdom, and plenty of teachers who filled minds of students, but didn't form their hearts in some way. And when I consider the world that we live in today, the cultural moment in which we're raising our children and training students, this quote sort of feels like it's hitting close to home still. I think it's because we are a culture that's addicted to data and yet suspicious of truth. And we clamor for information, but we resist wisdom. And we hold opinions tightly and truth very loosely. Our children are growing up in the midst of some of this chaos and being trained by social media and advertising and news feeds and influencers, and even educational institutions encourage them to question everything except their own desires. We hear constant cries for justice, equality, freedom, identity, and choice, but seldom do we ask the deeper questions: whose justice, whose equality, whose righteousness, and whose image? And these aren't just philosophical questions that are being asked, they're deeply practical. They touch on how we vote, how we live, how we spend, how we worship, how we raise our children, and how we educate. And so it seems to me that these things, they connect to logic in some really important ways. Logic is the art and the discipline of right reasoning. It's how we distinguish what is true from what is false. It's the structure behind our thoughts and the scaffolding that supports sound judgment. And it's the method by which we should examine the world, weigh evidence, challenge assumptions, and then try to arrive slowly, carefully, honestly at wisdom. but it's more than a technique. It's more than a skill we teach our middle schoolers because we want them to ace standardized tests or win debates. In the classical tradition, especially with the Christian vision of education, logic was a moral act. It is a spiritual practice. It's a discipline of the soul. And when I think of the formation of the soul, my mind often goes to Proverbs. Today, I want to invite you to listen afresh to the words of Proverbs 2 and consider with me how logic and the pursuit of truth and wisdom plays a role in our spiritual formation. It's written, "My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding, indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding." And when I read these verses or these different verses, I see here sort of a sequence. There's hearing, there's crying out, there's searching, seeking, and then understanding, and then knowledge, and then wisdom that follows. And the pursuit of knowledge here, the way we see it, it's not passive. It's very active. It's intense and desperate even. Um, we're called to search for it as hidden treasure, and not for its own sake, but so that we find the fear of the Lord, to grasp understanding and to walk in righteousness and in justice. So this isn't about, gaining knowledge isn't about becoming smart. It's about becoming wise. Wisdom is always moral, it's always spiritual, and in scripture, wisdom, like all of the other attributes of God, is always ordered. Wisdom is directed toward the love of God and the good of others. God is a God of order, and we see this when we look at the harmony of nature and the seasons, ecosystems and human biology. They all reveal God's intricate design and ordering. And when we look at the cosmos, he determines the numbers of the stars and calls them each by name, the psalmist says. The universe reflects order in both magnitude and in detail. God's world is ordered, and yet we don't see this order only in the way he constructs the natural world or in the way he holds the cosmos together. We see it evident in who he is. In Malachi, it's written, "For I, the Lord, do not change." We see his order evidenced in books like Daniel and Revelation, which shows God's control over time and history, reflecting divine scheduling and foresight. And he has given us a moral character in the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. They lay out a path for righteous living and interpersonal relationships. St. Augustine reminds us that there is an order to virtue. We find virtue when we rightly order our loves. Well, what does that mean for us as educators and as homeschooling parents? It means we are not just called to fill our children's mind. We are to shape their affections and form their loves with them. We are training them to love what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, and what is holy. And this is the great task of classical education. Not merely the transference of facts, but the cultivation of virtue through the ordering of the soul. That ordering happens not just emotionally, but intellectually. We teach children to think rightly so that they may love rightly, to reason soundly so that they may live wisely, to see clearly so they can discern truly. Logic, rightly taught, is the tool that allows us to order our minds, test ideas, uncover errors, and move towards truth. Hugh of St. Victor also wrote that logic, though last to be discovered, ought to be first learned. Well, why is that? It's because all of the other sciences, whether ethics or mathematics or theology or natural sciences, they all depend on sound reasoning. Logic is not a standalone subject. It's foundational. It is the servant of wisdom, the midwife of understanding, the defender of truth. In our digital age, your children will have more access to information than any generation in human history, but that's not going to help them or protect them. What will prepare them to live with integrity and courage and humility and clarity? It's the discipline to pursue wisdom and the fear of the Lord, the ability to reason with wisdom, the capacity to love truth and reject falsehood, the virtue to think and speak prudently. And that's why we teach logic. If we take a closer look at what's at stake when we say that logic is not merely a mental activity, but a sacred calling, we see that scripture and classical thinkers alike testify that the pursuit of knowledge is ultimately an act of worship. This elevates our vision for education, especially for home education, because it transforms study from a chore into a vocation and from information gathering into formation. And if we return again to Proverbs 2, it doesn't begin with facts or figures or curriculum, it begins with posture. If you accept my words, that's putting yourself under something in humility. If you call out for insight, there again is an act of humility. If you seek like silver, the pursuit of knowledge in the biblical vision is not about checking boxes or finishing assignments. It's a heart level hunger. It's an intense longing for insight, a willingness to cry out, to search, to dig, to pray, to meditate. And the fruit, of course, is the understanding and the fear of the Lord. The student who begins with seeking ends with reverence. The act of learning leads to worship. The act of thinking leads to adoration, and that's not by accident. We've sometimes treated education, especially in our modern culture, as a sort of purely practical enterprise. We ask questions like, will my child get into college? Will this curriculum help raise test scores? Will this subject be useful to a future career? And these aren't bad questions, but they're inadequate questions. They assume that the ultimate end of education is usefulness. But in the classical Christian tradition, education is not primarily utilitarian, it's formational. It's about shaping who a person is, not just what they know. Now, it's not to say that it doesn't have any usefulness, of course, but education is not merely about what we know, it's about who we become. We expect too little of it in many cases. The Christian tradition, especially the monastics and the classical tradition, they've always emphasized the formational nature of learning, and that's why thinkers like Hugh of St. Victor described the work of a scholar as involving 5 things. Study or instruction, and that's the part of education that we're probably most familiar with, or what we might think of first, the disciplined reading and note-taking, attending, inquiry involved in formal learning. But there's also meditation, deep reflection on what has been learned, taking ideas into the soul and pondering them with patience. Prayer, inviting the Holy Spirit to illuminate, to correct, and to shape our understanding. Performance, speaking or writing what we have learned, teaching others, articulating truth in community. And then contemplation, sort of gazing upon the highest truths with the eyes of the soul, seeking wonder and awe and unity with God. These aren't 5 different jobs. They're the 5 movements of the soul, 5 expressions of a heart oriented toward the love of God through the life of the mind. You can build these into some of your homeschooling or classroom days in simple but meaningful ways. Scolay Academy has a liturgical process that it goes through, and many of these elements that I'm about to share are echoed in the liturgical blessings that the teachers go through with their students. But beginning the day with prayer and asking God for wisdom, inviting your children to pause and think deeply about a question rather than rush to the answer. When your child says something insightful, to stop and dwell on it together. To use recitation time to let your child speak what they have learned in their own words. And even to end the day or to end the class not just with what was covered, but with what was wondered. And so, what's the method for doing this kind of work? Well, in classical education, we have a path that you're probably very familiar with, the trivium. And in Latin, the trivium literally means the three ways or the three paths. And we're probably all familiar with the grammar and logic and rhetoric. Grammar is the knowledge of how to speak and write without error. Logic is the art of reasoning or distinguishing truth from falsehood. And then rhetoric is the art of persuasion or communicating truth compellingly and beautifully. Hugh of St. Victor wrote that these arts are not simply academic tools, they are the method for our intellectual work. They help us rightly order our thoughts and words as we seek wisdom. So we see that logic is the foundation of right thinking. It's the mental scaffolding that makes understanding possible. It's the discipline that enables all of the other disciplines. So when we teach logic, we're not just teaching a subject, we're teaching a way of seeing. And as Proverbs says, our children were made to seek. They were made to ask questions and to wonder, to pursue and to discover. And yet, in this world flooded with noise and distractions and opinions, they need more than just curiosity. They need discernment. They need to be trained to recognize the truth and resist the error, to be formed in wisdom and not just filled with information. And that work begins with logic because logic's about thinking clearly, about forming the soul in such a way that truth is not only grasped, but hopefully that it's really cherished. Robert de Sorbonne, who's the founder of the Sorbonne in Paris, once said, "The sword of God's word is forged by grammar." The word of God is forged by grammar. It's sharpened by logic and burnished by rhetoric, but only theology can use it. In this image, logic is the sharpening process. It refines your thoughts, removes dullness, eliminates sloppiness, and prepares us to handle truth with clarity and care. To be clear, in your homes and in your classrooms, you are forging swords. You are training children to think deeply, to speak truly, and discern wisely. And that means that logic isn't just sort of a nice to have, check the box kind of course. It's a necessary edge. And some parents probably fear that that edge will be turned on them at home and their children will be argumentative. And it probably does mean that. But the difference is that logic doesn't train kids to bicker. It trains them to argue well, to argue honestly, to argue fairly, to argue charitably, to listen, to question, to think. And that's the kind of argument we desperately need in our world today. At the heart of logic are what philosophers call the three acts of the mind: simple apprehension, judgment, and inference. Simple apprehension is sort of grasping the concept. You answer the question, what is it? Judgment is asserting something about that concept and discerning, is it true? And inference is drawing conclusions from premises, and we kind of answers, well, what follows if that is true? And these are sort of the basic movements of thought. Every sentence you speak, every claim you consider, every book you read, it all depends on your brain doing these three acts of the mind without you really even thinking about it. And by training students to understand these patterns, we're giving them the tools for life, not just for the tools for school. But there's actually a fourth act. We don't even name this one in our textbook, but it's an essential in Christian education. It's contemplation. It's beholding the truth with reverence. It's the moment when your student, having reasoned through a hard idea, suddenly sees not just the answer, but the goodness of the answer, the clarity, the beauty, the resonance with reality. C.S. Lewis warns us in The Abolition of Man that we often make men without chests. We teach students to feel but not to think, and we give them slogans but not standards, and we encourage them to express themselves but not to test their expressions against truth. And logic reverses that trend. It builds the habits of the mind, disciplined, ordered, truthful habits. It trains the soul to slow down, consider, evaluate, and pursue what is real. And in doing so, it teaches students not just to win arguments, but how to love what is really true. When we teach logic, we invite our children into a long, rich, beautiful conversation. We hand them the tools that built Western civilization, formed the minds of theologians, shaped the speeches of the saints, sharpened the sermons of the revivalists. We're not just passing on a subject, we're inviting them into that conversation. But if we want to bring it down to the kitchen table or the classroom desk, we have to talk about how you as a homeschooling parent and as a teacher can teach logic to your student. You don't need a philosophy degree. You don't need to be an expert logician. You just need to have a vision, a rhythm, and a little bit of courage. One of the first questions that I often hear is, well, when should I begin teaching logic? And the answer really is gradually and intentionally based on your child's development. We already talked about the fact that in classical education, we sort of say there are these three different stages. There's grammar, logic, and rhetoric. We typically say that, generally speaking, the grammar stage is somewhere, between sort of first grade and fourth grade, give or take, through about 9 or 10 years old. And these are the years of memorization, repetition, fact absorption. You're laying the foundations, not just for knowledge, but for future reasoning. At this stage, you're not really teaching logic in a formal, systematic way, but you're preparing for it. You're teaching cause and effect. You're naming things rightly. You're modeling clear speech. You're practicing attention and curiosity. And then when the kids get a little bit older, say in, fifth or sixth grade up through eighth or ninth grade, that's sort of the sweet spot for teaching logic. That's when we offer it at Scholia Academy. That's sort of the age range that we're writing the books for. And around, ages 11 to 14, most students begin to question and debate and spot contradictions. This is why parents are worried that kids are going to argue with them, because sometimes we don't make sense, or at least they don't think we do. Their minds are beginning to awaken to abstract thought, and that means it's time for naming the informal fallacies. The world it can be intimidating when you don't have the words to identify what you see happening. And that's one of the things that I think parents are struggle with the most, is that they haven't learned the names for their fallacies, so that when they see them popping up, they know there's something wrong, but they don't have the vocabulary for it. And as soon as you have the vocabulary for it and you know what it is, you can state it, and then you can address it. But without the language for it, you feel like you're intimidated by what's going on and what you see in the world. And this is why we have to give the students the tools for naming those informal fallacies, understanding how to spot them. And then when they get a little bit older, we can start talking about formal logic. Formal being logic that has more of a form or structure. This is where we look at logic in the form of categorical statements or syllogisms. And those words even are very off-putting to parents. Most parents don't go around talking about categorical statements and syllogisms, but we've heard the word fallacy before, but how often do you really bring up the word syllogism at the dining room table or in, just general conversation? So even right there, this vocabulary feels like a little bit of a barrier, but these words they're easy to access. It's the text can walk you through them very systematically, introduce them easily, and you put the informal and formal logic together, and then you can start discussing arguments in literature and in history and just in the world around you. And then here comes the rhetoric stage, we say sort of 9th through 12th grade. And that's where logic becomes integrated into persuasion and expression. And students should learn how to structure those arguments and anticipate objections and speak with both clarity and with grace. At this point, logic becomes not only a subject, but a tool in every subject. So, if your child is really starting to ask the why and how do you know questions, it's probably it's about time for you to start logic. Well, the good news is in those first years when, when you're just preparing the soil for a study in logic, it doesn't require long lectures or dense textbooks. It flourishes in discussion and laughter and examples and even games. You can start with informal logic and move to formal logic later. And we can use real life examples and fallacy spotting. Um, One of my favorite things, and something that I don't know if Ash and Jimmy are still doing, but when I used to teach logic classes, I would find a way to record back when there was VHS players, and you had to actually, hit record during the Super Bowl. And I would record all of the Super Bowl commercials. And then I would bring them into the class and we would evaluate them together. The Monday after Super Bowl Sunday was every kid's favorite logic class day, because they knew that we were going to be going through those ads and we were going to be picking out the fallacies that we saw. And they're amusing. They're fun. Sometimes they're a little stupid, but the kids can find out very easily what's being assumed. Why doesn't this make sense? Why is it funny in some way? Those fallacy examples and spotting the fallacies is a really easy way to help them start to see that it's everywhere. They can read editorials and online articles to identify weak arguments. They can listen to their siblings argue at the dinner table and then analyze those arguments for structure and error. And, as they get older, we can introduce terms like premise and conclusion, validity and soundness, and fallacy. It's important to know that fallacy and false are not the same thing, and that a valid argument isn't the same as a sound argument, and truth and validity aren't the same thing. Now, in our colloquial, world, as we use this language just on an everyday basis, it's really not important to sort of split hairs. We can usually figure out what somebody means, but your students and you can start to understand that something can be true and be fallacious. They could have gotten to the answer the wrong way. It's how every math problem ends up with the right answer, but they still don't know how to do the problem, right? It's because you can get the right answer sometimes by accident or through error, but what we really want to do is teach students how to ensure that they can get the right answer more times than not. You can practice with real arguments and have your students evaluate those arguments, like I said, in literature. Is the character reasoning well? If you ever, when you look at character structure in literature, it's rare that a plot line develops without a logical error of some time, an error of reasoning, an assumption that's made, lack of clarity, a missed cue of some kind. Usually plots are built around some sort of logical fallacy. It's how the structure of a story begins to take shape. There has to be a miscommunication. There has to be a misunderstanding. There has to be something that is unexpected in some ways. And you can start to identify those places in literature. You can start to identify if the characters in the story are, constantly jumping to conclusions, sweeping generalizations. Is that their flaw? It's easy to start to spot these in the characters that are made because characters very much resemble the humans that we are. You can start looking for evaluating arguments in history. Was that political decision logically justified? Looking back at arguments for why Supreme Court cases were either valid or invalid, or why they were passed in some way, you can listen to the commentary, and very often the commentators they're not really consistent with themselves when they go through and make an argument. There are biases and underlying assumptions built in there. And as you study your Bible, you can ask yourself, how does Paul build his case in Romans? That would be a tricky one. I mean, that's a complex book. But to try to understand what are the fundamental building blocks that he moves through just through the book of Romans to see how does he build that argument? He's one of prime examples of how there's this beautiful blend of sort of theological understanding and the move of the Holy Spirit, but with logical thinking woven together. And of course, that would be, the ultimate success stories if your students could really kind of see and think like Paul in some ways. Eventually moving into formal logic and sort of teaching those basic syllogisms. You've all heard the sort of the age-old, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You can identify valid and invalid reasoning, and you can let them start to build and test their own syllogisms. And as the press, as Ash mentioned, we've got a couple of books that can help do this with you. And Scholarly Academy can help you do this as well when you're ready to do it in a formal way. The Art of Argument is ideal for focusing on the informal fallacies and the discovery of deduction, introduces formal logic, introducing those propositions and syllogisms. There's other great resources out there. Peter Kraft has his Socratic logic. That would be for older students or maybe as a supplement to you as an adult. And then there's, if you've got really young kids and you kind of just want them to dabble a little bit, there's the Fallacy Detective or the Argument Clinic. And then, of course, there's Classical Youth as well that can come alongside. But the key is really to make it lively and not lifeless. Logic is a living art. Let it breathe in your home. You don't have to be dry or clinical. Logic can be fun. In fact, it often is. Fallacies are absurd. Kids love to spot them. You can even pose silly structured arguments even at your dinner table. I mean, summer vacation is probably upon you. We should go to the Outer Banks for vacation because, or, we should order X for dinner because. Have your children argue for the movie that they want to see or hanging out with their friends. Require it of them that they build an argument for what it is that they want to do. Make a presentation. If you ever have a chance to talk to Dr. Blake, who I said is watching at their home, I think it's annually, they give sort of family presentations. And you should ask her sometime what these family presentations, sometimes it involves a slideshow. But the whole family gathers together, and then there's each child in their family gets to make a presentation for something. Those kids are learning how to do rhetoric, build arguments in their home, just as a part of a family tradition. It's a great idea. Let the kids keep logic journals in a notebook, arguments that they've made or heard that week, and then evaluate them together. The goal isn't to turn your child into a debater, it's to help them become a clear thinker, a truth lover, a wise speaker. So here's a couple of traps I'll say to sort of watch out for. Avoid making logic purely academic. Don't let it become a dry drill. Keep it connected to real life. Avoid allowing your children to use logic to be disobedient. If your child starts to logic their way out of chores or to challenge your parental authority, remind them that truth and humility have to go together. Logic must be ordered to love, and obedience is an example of love. Avoid overcorrecting every error. Let your kids explore and get messy with the ideas. You don't have to turn logic into grammar policing. Train for discernment, not for perfection. Avoid teaching logic without modeling it. This is the hardest one. Ask yourself, are you consistent in your own reasoning? Are you open to correction? Generous in debate? Humble in disagreement? Our kids learn more by watching than by hearing. It's not just for 8th grade, it's for real life. Reading the news headlines, writing a business proposal, leading a team, voting, evangelizing, counseling a friend, discerning God's will. Logic rooted in virtue, shaped by scripture, guided by humility becomes one of the greatest gifts you can give your child. Think about the traits we hope to see in our children: clarity of thought, honesty in speech, integrity in reasoning, patience in dialogue, humility in disagreement. These are virtues. They're cultivated through logic, rightly taught. To reason requires restraint. To test your assumptions requires humility. To revise your argument requires courage. To listen to a counterpoint requires love. This is what makes logic so countercultural today, because we live in a world where emotion trumps reason and outrage overshadows understanding and sound bites replace sound thinking. And yet we're calling our children to something higher, to learn how to love truth and not just win arguments. What you might hear is that I'm suggesting that training logic can be a part of how the fruit of the Spirit becomes evidenced in the lives of those who study it. When Paul describes the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, we often forget that these qualities should show up in our intellectual lives as well as our behaviors. We tend to apply them to just behaviors, but what about our thinking? Do we reason with patience? Do we speak with gentleness? Do we listen with self-control? Do we seek truth and love? Logic gives us that framework for right thinking, but only the Spirit can give us the grace to think rightly with virtue. And that's why prayer has to be a part of the educational process. That's why humility must be modeled in our homes, and why we must confess when we are wrong and celebrate when truth is discovered, even if it isn't our idea. Because ultimately, we're not raising children to be winners of arguments. We're raising them to be lovers of truth and servants of Christ. Logic participates in this ordering. As I said, their minds become clearer, their emotions can become steadier. A lot of the feelings that they feel in the world and why there are things that upset them is because they can be afraid of what's going on in the world, afraid of how to handle something, insecure about how to get out of a tight situation, or to be the only one who might be saying the right thing in an echo chamber of wrong things. Their speech can become kinder, and their discernment can become stronger, and in short, they can become more like Christ in some of these ways. He never spoke falsely. He never reasoned poorly. He never argued manipulatively. He was wisdom incarnate. And if our goal is to raise children in his image, then training them in logic can be a part of discipleship. As a virtue, a habit of the soul, a mode of love, a path to wisdom. That's the question. What is the end of logic? Not just end as in conclusion, but what is its purpose? I hope that the end of logic is really worship. I want to be very clear. Reason reveals, but it doesn't replace. And that's an important distinction to make here. Logic is not the ultimate authority in a Christian life. Of course, God is, Scripture is, but logic is God-given, and it's an instrument that we can use to help illuminate and light our path. So if we return to that quote from Sorbonne, the sword of God's word is forged by grammar, sharpened by logic, and burnished by rhetoric, but only theology can use it. We can see here the words and the categories and the terms, the testing for truth and making them persuasive. But knowing and worshiping God, that's theology, but it's done with the hand that wields that sword. And this is why we can't isolate logic from the rest of teaching. It's only dangerous when it's disconnected from truth. Logic is only harmful when it's divorced from virtue, but in the hands of the wise or of the humble, of the worshiper, it becomes a tool of discernment and a gift. So a couple of just sort of closing remarks for families and teachers. You're doing sacred work. You're not just supervising lessons. You're not just grading papers. You're not just choosing curriculum. You're forming souls. You're inviting your children into the pursuit of wisdom. You're shaping their minds, their loves, their habits. You're helping them to see the world as God made it, to see that it is intelligible and ordered and purposeful. And when you teach logic at home, even imperfectly, and heaven knows I do it probably more imperfectly than anybody else, My daughter's sitting over in the next room, and if she was here, she'd probably be nodding. But imperfectly or not, you're giving your children a tool for a lifetime to discern what is true from what is false, to stand firm in a confused world, to speak clearly when others shout, to love wisdom in a world of noise, to walk in the fear of the Lord, and to find knowledge. It doesn't matter that you do it imperfectly. What matters is that you do it faithfully. When you train a child to think clearly, it really does equip them to live wisely. So I'll leave you with this. It's often said that logic is the queen of the sciences, and her throne is wisdom, her servants are clarity, charity, and courage, and her end, her true and final end, is worship. And that's my little chat for you. All right. I don't know if there are questions or if there's any comments that Jimmy or Ash want to make, how you see this playing out in your classrooms, or if anybody has questions, I'm happy. All three of us can answer. They have been teaching logic almost as long as I have been at this point. So
We have one question from Shannon. If we could get the quote and attribution again of the sword of God's word being forged in grammar from the founder of the Sorbonne.
oh yeah, let's see if I can find it here. If I don't know if I have it as a, I'll just quote it. How about that? The sword of God's word is forged by grammar, sharpened by logic, and burnished by rhetoric, but only theology can use it. The sword of God's word is forged by grammar, sharpened by logic, and burnished by rhetoric, but only theology can use it.
I see one in the webinar chat. Robert is asking, first of all, that currently their school is sticking with the Art of Argument book for 7th grade and then the Argument Builder for 8th grade. But he's got a question: is it a bad approach, or are they missing out on something to not bring in the discovery of deductions? I would shoot that to either Jolie or Jimmy as those who teach both.
Do you want to answer, Jimmy? I have an answer, but you.
Yeah, go ahead. You go first.
Well, the way I would say it is that the art of art, what we've really done with the art of argument and the discovery of deduction is sort of split introductory logic into two pieces, one for the informal side, one for the formal side. We say logic is both the art and the science of reasoning. And so that's really, those are the two parts of logic. When you do just the art of argument, you're missing the part that is the formal logic side, the deductive side of logic. The argument builder, and I know this is a little bit tricky because the art of argument and argument builder both have the word argument in them, and it seems like they are the companion text, but they're really not. It really should be done with the art of argument, then discovery of deduction, because that's really your whole course of introductory logic. And then argument builder is in some ways almost like a pre-rhetoric text. It basically takes the common topics from a course of rhetoric and it focuses on those for a semester and really just highlights those. And so then when you take a formal rhetoric class, then you'll go through the 5 canons of rhetoric, and part of the 5 canons is those common topics. But the argument builder really kind of pulls those out and gives them sort of a special treatment as the students sort of make their way through to a course of rhetoric. So I do think that there is something that's missed when students don't get the full context of logic, both the informal and the formal, both the inductive and the deductive logic, one year after the other. But that would be my answer. I don't know how you would answer it, Jimmy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously a really great answer. I mean, I think that I have found that students enjoy the deductive side in a different way than the art of argument side. And some of that is that art of argument side is dealing with kind of normal language arguments, the way you might argue with your siblings or your teachers or friends or whatever. But the deductive side really, I think, adds a way of really investigating the language that's being used, and the arguments that are kind of substantiating the claims. And so for me, it's a deeper, richer kind of, in some ways more complex view and look at arguments, but one that I think really helps students start to make connections between what they saw in our art of argument and, what they're seeing in discovery of deduction.
To build on that answer in some ways, when we teach the fallacy of equivocation in the art of argument, which is one of the fallacies of clarity, what happens when they get to the discovery of deduction is they see sort of the linguistic architecture that makes the fallacy actually happen. So the fallacies, when you learn the informal fallacies in the art of argument, you start to recognize the patterns of seeing them and hearing them in everyday life. But when you learn the discovery of deduction and you look, it's like pulling back the curtain and sort of seeing the architecture of why those fallacies happen, why sweeping generalizations happen. And well, it's because people are, taking a universal, something that's really only a particular truth and pretending like it's a universal truth. And so it's this way of kind of putting it all together so that they can see the fuller picture, not just knowing how to drive the car, but maybe understanding, how a car runs in some ways so that you can take care of it a little bit better. So that's why those two, they really do go hand in hand. They sort of meld together when you teach them together, and you can tell that they're influencing each other in some ways.
I've got a question in the sideboard from Ian, who's been using the Art of Argument book for a while, and is curious about the features that we should highlight about the new revised edition.
I'll let you two answer that because you're the ones that are actually teaching with the new revised edition.
Well, the new art of argument has extra colors and colored images. No, I'm just kidding. That is true, but that's not the only reason to use it. I think for me, there's a lot of updated language in it. There's more modern examples, that are pulled into each of the texts. I think it has kind of grown on that foundation that was there in the original text, and then now the new version expounds on some things there, and especially like there are some really complicated. Some fallacies are fairly simple, like the ad hominem abusive, right? It's like and can clearly tell when someone is attacking a person for their character or appearance or whatever. But some of the fallacies, like the differences between a hasty generalization, a sweeping generalization, composition and division, are fairly complicated. When you present them to students, they seem fairly similar. But the new text, I think, helps really navigate the differences between those. And I think that makes it easier for the teacher as well as the student to engage with some of the more complex fallacies.
Mhm. And I would say in the teacher edition that they've also expanded on providing outside resources, links, articles, videos that have really enriched what I've been able to bring into class. Expanded on some sections of these are some pitfalls your student might fall into when you're covering the fallacy in this lesson, and here are some discussion topics to help them have some more clarity with that, or here are some ways to help them avoid those particular pitfalls. So it really feels like you, the instructor, have been given a new pile of rich treasures from which to draw um, from the teacher edition as well. So that's the good. And I think that it's done a really good job of some areas that so I'm thinking about the example of, we talk a lot about non-argumentative persuasion, where you're not committing a fallacy because a fallacy is an argument that you're making, albeit a bad one. But that non-argumentative persuasion isn't making an argument at all. So what is that then? Like there's some, more expansive explanation for the students as to what that is. And I think it's just different sections throughout the book that have done a better job of helping make more clear some of the terminology and concepts that maybe weren't as clear in the previous edition.
I'm glad to hear all of that. That was part of the goal. And Ash and Jimmy both were actually asked to look at the book before it came out so that they could help make sure we weren't, belaboring something or, not providing a good explanation. So some of that has to do with them pointing out areas where things needed to be refined or, drawn out a little bit more. But when we went to do the revised edition, I basically sort of thought to myself as I was moving out of teaching and into a more sort of corporate business role, I'm probably not going to be going back out into the classroom anytime soon. So I just took all the things that I used in my class, all of the resources, all of the pedagogical approaches, all of the links and, all of those kinds of things, and just put it all into the teacher's edition, sort of almost like as a handoff. A lot of the questions that come in are asking like, well, how do you do this? And wanted to give more information. So there's probably more in there, I think, than either one of you probably don't do every single thing that's in there and use every single resources. But the idea was to give you lots of launching off points so that as a teacher you could start to build your confidence and then go even find your own resources, because anytime you build a text it's going to be finite. We're not updating it every year, but the hope was that it would give a new teacher enough resources that they would feel really confident about going into that year, and then helping maybe launch them into their own journey in some ways. So
There is.
Lori?
Oh,
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, there was another question from Lori about a good age or grade to start the Art of Argument curriculum.
It's intended to start around 7th or 8th grade. I do think, and Ash, you and Jimmy, you can answer this question too. I find that a lot of families, they may think that they have a child, maybe a 4th or 5th grader who's, they're reading at a high level and they've got good comprehension skills and all of those kinds of things. And I'm not in any way saying that they can't memorize the 28 fallacies, but sometimes when you're really trying to lift it out of the textbook, and in this textbook, it's, there are some real world examples in there that start to get a little bit complex and a little bit more mature, not in a sort of an extreme way, but some of these things are just maybe better to maybe wait until they just get a little bit older, maybe to 13 or so, before they start, trying to delve into thinking through some of, when it gets beyond the Super Bowl commercials, right? And the literature, and you start to get to some of the real world and application areas. So that is usually when we suggest starting it. And then with the discovery of deduction, there's absolutely no math in the discovery of deduction. So I sometimes hesitate to say this, but I don't want to, scare anybody away. But I usually say, if your student has successfully completed a course in pre-algebra where they've had to reason for X, they have to solve for X, which is an abstract, right? When they've been able to do that and really been able to do that well, then they're very ready to start reasoning in the abstract for discovery of deduction. But if your child is sort of developmentally just very literal and that wouldn't make sense to them, then it's too soon to do the discovery of deduction. But I don't know how you all handle it when you get rages of kids in your class.
Yeah, because we tend to get mainly middle schoolers, but I always have the occasional 9th, 10th grade-ish aged kid in there. And Jimmy and I have had some conversations about, how to handle that level of age range, even within the same class, that have been, helpful and productive, just to keep younger kids from feeling alienated and unsure of what we're talking about. But then how do you make sure that the older kid doesn't feel like this information is being dumbed down for them, and and all of that. So it's I usually draw on you know the wisdom of differentiating when I've got a wide variety of kids. But I think that the book itself is going to do I think it's going to be fine for middle and like early high school age kids, but then he and I will tend to sort of edit, then what are we bringing in, what kinds of concepts are we, then what other resources, what other videos, what other clips are we bringing in, really is going to depend on what is the age range skewing in that particular section. I don't know, Jimmy, if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the age range is difficult in the class. I know that's not totally the question, but it is this, thing of trying to merge those two pieces together. And I think I know we had some people in the webinar chat ask about teaching the class, but for me, I think I find too that like the older a student is, perhaps I expect a little bit more out of them in engagement when we're talking about fallacies, for instance, and um, or some of the papers that they write, or some of the way their assignments roll out, and I think that's I think it's a maybe unfair but fair at the same time, where the expectations are not always the same, but I think that as Jolie and Ash have said, the grade wise, that middle school age is a really positive one to start. And Emily asked a question about like, what are the signs of readiness? Like Jolie, I think, mentioned that at some point students start to argue with you, and not just, I have a 7-year-old and she's asking me like the why questions, now, which is, it's been fun, and slightly annoying at times, I think. But I think what Jolie was getting at is like that's sixth, seventh, eighth grade range. They're not just asking why, but they're really seeking to understand, right? And so the arguments are not just convince me, but explain and dialogue with me through this. And so if students are starting to do that, that's a good time to introduce this. I also would think that, I think if students have a writing background, that's extremely helpful. As I think what that demonstrates is their ability to carry a flow of reasoning through and across a period of time. And so it doesn't have to be a very complex argument, but their ability to kind of carry one thought from the beginning of a paragraph to the end of a paragraph is a sign that, like, okay, their brains and minds are starting to think in that direction. And I don't know that this might be kind of like a soft marker, but I've had students who, they start to get interested in bigger picture things, politics, their Christianity and their own theology. They're really seeking to understand what it means to follow Jesus in this. And they're thinking through that, how it affects their life, what's going on in their world. They tend to started to expand maybe their scope and understanding of the world around them. So those are, I don't know, some of those non-grade related skills maybe that I would look for if I were a parent and thinking about starting this particular curriculum.
That was that point about them writing and being able to carry that train of the thinking through, and start with some sort of an idea and then build towards something. I hadn't thought of that, but that's a really, really good indicator. Take the spelling out of it, because that's a whole different like skill set, but it's you want some way to see how they're thinking and how they are able to think, and holding longer conversations like Jimmy is talking about, and then asking them to do some writing. That's where you kind of get a peek under the hood to see like how are their brains making sense of everything.
Yeah.
There's a I don't want to advocate for this particular podcast because it's not always something that I would recommend, but there's a podcast called This American Life. You may have heard of it. There's an episode called Kid Logic, and if you have a chance to listen to that particular episode, particularly I think the first, the second, and the last, they do them in acts. So I think it's acts 1, 2, and 4. um, they've kind of started to articulate the different ways that kids are trying to make sense of their world. And you can get a sense for their thinking and how ready they are. The first example on that podcast is there's a I think the woman is like a sociologist or some, and she's on a plane and she's sitting next to a 4 or 5 year old on the plane, and the little girl keeps looking at herself, and the sociologist looks at her and says, what are you doing? And she said, when do we get smaller? And it's because from the Earth, planes get really tiny up in the sky, right? And she didn't have a sense for the fact that how far away that is, and that things get smaller the further away you are, just visually. And she's trying to make sense of it. And that's the kind of thing that you want to see is like, where is your kid? Where are they thinking? How are they thinking? And writing is a really good way to do that. That was a
Yeah, and
great.
I think like to that point too, it's maybe the distinction too for me is it's not just the writing is not just a reporting of facts,
Hmm.
it's there's a sense in which you can write a paper where all you're doing is reporting the facts of the material. But there's a different level in trying to make then connections between the facts that lead to a conclusion you're trying to prove for something. And I think that, when students start to do that on a little bit of a basis and or with regularity, I guess they're really heading in that direction. This is a silly example, but like, in my class, I typically I typically have them write a research paper to start about something that they believe in. And it can be anything. So kids write really serious papers, very difficult topics about why they think, abortion is wrong, right? And they'll take on a big topic like that and write that early on. And then I'll get really silly papers like why they think Bigfoot might exist. But it accomplishes, but the interesting part for me is you get a chance to see the way they're reasoning through a topic. And so this student last year wrote a topic about why he thought Bigfoot existed. But the whole thing being, he makes this point in it that I always think about is like, well, we didn't discover silverback gorillas until like the 50s. So it's possible based on a small portion or a small group of animals, maybe we just haven't discovered them yet. But the point being there, right? He's rationalizing, well, okay, we didn't discover them until then. What other animals might have we not discovered? And what does this say about the argument I'm trying to make? Right. And
Mhm.
he's, seventh grade thinking through that. And I think that's like a really interesting way he's thinking through things. Yeah, I think it kind of just goes along with that idea.
Yeah, I love it. That's great. I would love to read that paper.
Ashley was asking a question about they're starting a new Christian classical school and are thinking about the art of argument for their 6th through 12th grade students. But these students would not have had any experience with classical education. And, is that appropriate then? And I would say yes. I mean, I taught the art of argument at a private Christian school that was not classical for over a decade. And that worked very well for us.
I mean,
So,
I think it's a must. Like, I think you got to teach it. I mean, I
yeah.
think that logic is, I mean, first of all, on the teaching side of it, if you're teaching it, it's really fun. Like, I think it's a really fun topic to teach. It is very interactive. Students really tend to engage. And um, so it's really an enjoyable thing, and I think you absolutely should do it for your school. And you'll learn to me, you'll learn to navigate the age differences.
Mhm.
It might take you a little bit of time, but you'll find a good kind of like golden mean that goes through well where everyone seems to connect it. And because it's not like I don't know. The way, yeah, I don't know that it's like algebra 2 where you've got to take algebra 1 and pre-algebra that like lead to it. Logic is kind of like learning its own language in some ways. And so even if you have a 10th grader and a 7th grader, some of the language will be new to all of them at the same time. And so you'll find this like, maybe the 10th grader understands it a little bit quicker, but it's still new to both of them and they're still processing it the same way. So
Mhm. That's I think that there's something universal about wanting to be able to understand the world in this way, both younger kids and older kids and adults, so much so that Dr. Perrin and I are teaming up to write an adult version of basically the art of argument, so that people, adults who aren't going to sit down with a textbook, can still learn the fallacies and think through them, in something that's just can walk them through all the fallacies. When I host talks at various conferences and things, I've done a couple of sessions, and I think this video is included in the resources, but there's a video of Matt Damon explaining why Sarah Palin should not have been John McCain's running mate back in, what would that have been, 2008 or something. So there's a certain population that's just going to be like, who's John McCain? But anyway, but if you watch this video, he commits Matt, what is his name?
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon. He commits, I think it's something like 17 fallacies in the scope of a minute and a half. And I'll play this video for the people at the conference. And it's all parents and teachers who are sitting there. And I ask them after I finished playing it, okay, what did you see? Like, what fallacies? They don't have the words for it, but they're like, I know there's something wrong when he's talking about the dinosaurs, or whatever it is. And they just need, and as soon as I give them a little sheet of like what fallacies and what they're, all of a sudden it's like the world just opened up for them. And they're like, oh yeah, I can totally see what he's doing now, because they have the words that go with it. So I think both of them are right. You should definitely do it for the kids, no matter what grade they're in. And like Jimmy said, you'll adjust to the different age ranges, but everybody is looking to vocabulary is how we make sense of the world around us. And this is a great way to do that for all the students.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question about video resources to include in a classroom setting. I don't know how you guys did that, Ash or Jolie, when you were teaching it. What did you do to include resources in your classes?
So like I definitely, like I remember when I came on, you were very generous and let me look at your syllabus and some of your stuff. So
It
I
is
definitely,
proprietary that I stole
yeah,
from Jolie.
there we go. And so we've definitely shared, some like, oh, this video or that clip or whatever, with each other. But I remember Jolie saying at one point that it's so much more beneficial to, rather than just be handed here's a Google Doc with links to 50 different videos that have fallacies in them, blah, 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 to like really start generating that list on your own, or like amongst the faculty, that if the multiple of you are teaching them, if you've got like multiple sections with multiple faculty. Because we ourselves need the training of spotting fallacies, spotting poor arguments, and then explaining why ourselves. And so once we start, so I would say start with just getting on YouTube and just looking at different Super Bowl commercials from the past, because even if you have just a very early understand of the three categories of fallacies, those that are committing an irrelevance, something that is getting us off topic from the issue at hand, something that is distracting us with emotion rather than an actual argument, and then the clarity is muddled. You can start identifying those, and Super Bowl commercials are kind of a great just starting point. And then like once you start getting that under your belt, you're going to start seeing them everywhere, hearing them in podcasts and hearing them in songs. I'm sure Taylor Swift lyrics would be a treasure trove of emotional appeals, I would imagine. Yeah, so it's while it's nice and like, very generous if, another teacher has like, hey, I have a great video clip that I use for such and such. It is something that doing just a little bit of exploring on your own is, it's modeling it for your students. And it's one of those things that And your students will get this. Once you see and understand a fallacy, you can't unsee it, and suddenly they're seeing it everywhere. And the goal should be, I want to ruin your internet, TikTok, movie watching experience for your life because I want these things. Your brain's just not going to be able to shut it off. So that's what I would say about as far as finding good resources. But again, in the teacher textbook, there are even some links that Jolie has provided to. Like, there's a great one when you're talking about the false cause fallacy, where she provides links to a YouTube video of a guy who's messing around next to a subway and makes it seem like he's slowing the train with the force of his hands and then starting the train back up, but he's just, timing it correctly. But then there's another video she provides in there about this kind of ridiculous sounding theory that reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone National Park changed the rivers. And you're like, what? But then you watch this video and you see how the wolves coming in and then the food chain. And because there were less deer, then that was causing less erosion at the end of the lake and da, 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 and then one by one, you have all these steps. So there are definitely some extra resources for fun visual kinds of things on there too.
I'll just also note that something that Ash said, when you model it for your students, I mean, nobody handed me all of those, and I'm sure Ash and Jimmy have found their own fallacies as well. But as I found them and I walked into my class, on whatever the next day was, and I was so excited, like, I found another one, whether it was that podcast or the video or, and as soon as you see it, then and you get excited about it and you found one and you tell them that you found one, then they want to do it too, because the student will become like a teacher.
They're going to email you
Yeah.
YouTube videos and they say, I found this commercial and it's got, the appeal to ignorance in it, and da, da, da. And you go, great. And then I add it to my slideshow. I use it in class in perpetuity.
There you go. Yeah, train them to go do the research for you. Yeah, that's great.
We only have a few minutes left. If there are any more questions, go ahead and shoot them in the Q&A box there.
Trying to see if we missed one. There was a question earlier. Let me see if I can find this. It was asked, the art of argument contains 28 fallacies that seem presented as comprehensive, but in the argument builder, there are 18. Um, about half are found in the art of argument, and the other half are new. What is the relationship between these two sets? Is each book just stemming from different philosophical approaches to arguments, and therefore have different lists? I'm trying to be sure I can articulate the relationship between the two texts.
That's a really good question. You will probably not find any two textbooks that are authored by two different people that name the fallacies the exact same thing. And that's just very common. You could go get Copy text, you could get Craif's text, you could get ours, you could, whatever. Even the fallacy detective, you could line them all up, and there's going to be some that are similar and some that are not. The naming of logical fallacies is a relatively new invention, if you will. The discovery of deduction, the formal logic, that Aristotelian logic, that goes back to, not surprisingly, the time of Aristotle. But the naming of logical fallacies is something that occurred in the 20th century. It's been just different people identifying different names for the very similar concepts, and maybe with just a slight variation. Some folks think that they can kind of encapsulate them into a shorter list. Some people expand on them and sort of, parse them out even a little bit more. Like when you say, there's only 28 fallacies in the art of argument, it's like, that's true, but there's also all different kinds of begging the question fallacies, like sort of appeals to different excerpts are illegitimate authorities, and there's different kinds of illegitimate authority, and there's different kinds of false causes, and So there's actually more than 28 fallacies in there when you start to look at all the sub ones, and it's just a matter of how compact or how expanded you kind of want to go and thinking it through. And then there's just some different colloquial names. So I wouldn't, you know, and like I said, the argument builder really isn't the follow-up to the art of argument. So I'm not surprised that Dr. Shelley Johnson from Georgetown University and, Jolie Hodge from Enola, Pennsylvania, didn't align perfectly on exactly what we called all the fallacies. But the concepts are probably the same and maybe just categorized or named a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I get that question sometimes because we'll treat, for instance, red herring fallacies as a subcategory in art of argument, where when I learned it in college, I just learned red herring as a fallacy by itself, just an attempt to mislead or to move a conversation to a different topic or whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, just echoing Jolie's comment there that you're just going to find different lists and that's kind of frustrating, but also kind of the nature of of it as well. So
All right, I'm checking our Q&A. Well, it looks like we've no more questions. So just want to say thank you so much for joining us, those of you who are here with us live, as well as those of you who will be listening to this recording later. Thank you, Jolie, so much for your expertise, and thank you, Jimmy, for you know, adding in your experience from the classroom when it comes to these specific texts. And we wish you all a wonderful rest of your afternoon or morning from wherever you are Zooming in. Thank you so much for joining us.
Everyone, take care. Bye-bye.